We start with breaking news. World powers have approved a 30-day humanitarian ceasefire for Syria. A resolution was passed in a unanimous vote at the UN Security Council headquarters in New York. Well, Maupin is outside the UN HQ with the latest for where it has been for some time now. Caleb, tell us what has been agreed here, if you will.
Well, the resolution that was just passed after a lot of negotiation calls for a 30-day ceasefire. Now, the meeting was convened after much anticipation, a long delay, and finally taking place. The resolution was put forward, and it was unanimous. All 15 countries voted for it. Now, it calls for a 30-day ceasefire, but removed was the stipulation that this ceasefire had to take place within 72 hours. It no longer calls for an immediate ceasefire, but the resolution that was passed called for a ceasefire without delay. Now, this is referring to the fighting in Eastern Ghouta. Now, this is an enclave east of the Syrian capital of Damascus. It's long been a stronghold of rebels and terrorist groups, though it's been surrounded by government forces since 2013. As the fighting there has intensified, there has been a lot of civilian loss of life. There have been some very heated allegations being made against the Syrian government and against Russia. We have the Russian Council for Reconciliation in Syria reporting that essentially the area is being used to attack Damascus, a very densely populated area with 8 million civilians living in it. It's basically being used to launch attacks. In the past 24 hours, we've had roughly 4 people killed, with 51 people being injured by attacks launched against Damascus from Eastern Ghouta. So at this point, the resolution was passed calling for a 30-day ceasefire. Now, after the unanimous vote, we then heard from various countries. We heard from Nikki Haley of the United States, and she said she doesn't believe the Syrian government will actually comply with the ceasefire.
It is critical that the Assad regime and its allies comply with our demand to stop the assault on Eastern Ghouta and immediately allow food and medicine to reach everyone who needs it. All of us on this council must do our part to press the Assad regime as hard as we can to comply. We are deeply skeptical that the regime will comply, but we supported this resolution because we must demand nothing less.
Now, we also heard from the representative of the Russian Federation. Now, he addressed the Security Council, and he emphasized that the fight against terrorism is not affected by this resolution, that internationally delegated terrorist groups, groups like al-Nusra, ISIS, that the fight against them is not restricted by this resolution, and that fight will continue. He also had some concerns about how the fight against terrorism seemed to be serving some other goals. This is what he said to the Council after the unanimous vote.
The aim of battling terrorism can't become a cover for solving geopolitical problems of dubious legitimacy, and that is exactly what the U.S. is doing in Syria right now. We insist that the so-called coalition end its attempts at occupation as soon as possible. It would have, among other things, a clear humanitarian effect.
Now, Nikki Haley, the representative of the United States, walked out before the Syrian representative could speak. Under UN rules, if a resolution pertains to you, all countries have the right to address the Security Council. So when the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, Bashar Jafari, got up to address the Council, the U.S. representative walked out. Now, in Nikki Haley's remarks, she had spoken about the plight of civilians in Eastern Ghouta. And in his remarks, the Syrian ambassador talked about the civilians in Damascus, including medical workers who are being killed in the ongoing bombardment. However, Nikki Haley was not in the room to hear those remarks. Now, the Syrian ambassador said that the ceasefire would be implemented and that Syria would comply with it, and that, furthermore, the ceasefire would be implemented in Afrin and in the Golan Heights. Now, the Syrian ambassador, he spoke, and he pointed out that Syria, he argued, was fully in its rights to fight against terrorism on its own territory. He said that unlike the United States, which has forces all over the world, unlike the UK or France, countries that have deployed forces throughout the world in the name of fighting terrorism, Syria is only fighting terrorism within its own borders. He made that point very strongly. However, the U.S. ambassador walked out and did not hear those remarks. Now, the resolution has been passed passed, and it looks like there will be a 30-day ceasefire in Eastern Ghouta, and there will be a halt, and the purpose of this halt is a humanitarian pause of sorts, so that civilians can flee the area. The civilians are not. Now, we've heard from that Russian Center for Reconciliation in Syria. They've pointed out that one of the problems that's been going on in the fight is that terrorist forces in Eastern Ghouta are preventing medical assistance from getting to civilians. These terrorist forces are simply not allowing the civilians in Eastern Ghouta to get medical assistance. So this 30-day ceasefire that was agreed on by all 15 members of the council is going to be implemented. Throughout this entire conflict, there has been agreement among the different countries that the civilian life in Eastern Ghouta is important. Civilians should not be killed. Every effort should be made to protect them. However, in the lead up to the strong disagreements about who's to blame for the conflict and who's responsible for civilian suffering. But it looks like we have been resolved, and there has been a unanimous resolution passed by the body that leads the United Nations.
Okay, thanks very much for that update. Caleb Maupin live from New York. Let's get into the story further now and discuss it with Patrick Henningsen. Patrick is editor of 21stCenturyWire.com. Patrick, welcome. The Russian envoy was quite cautious about the deal, saying Russia, quote, supports the intentions behind the document, but that no ceasefire is possible without agreement from warring parties. How optimistic are you?
I would probably be in the same camp as the Russian ambassador. It's hugely complex to try to organize a deal, as we've seen in past instances, not just in Damascus and around Ghouta and Jobar, but also in Aleppo is probably a better comparison. So the problem is the West is framing this in terms of it's the Syrians and the Russians versus the civilians of Ghouta. But if you're on the ground in Syria, the reality is this is a terrorist faction that has, or a group of terrorist factions that have occupied part of a major city and are hurling mortars in every day, multiple times a day for the last 3 or 4 months intensely. We have thousands of civilians in Damascus killed, many injured. So this is terrorism, but this is not the way it's being framed by people like Nikki Haley in the Western coalition.
The hope is that this will now last. The main goal of the ceasefire is to allow humanitarian aid into the conflict zones. But do you see any sign of agreement between world powers on a long-term resolution for the troubled country? I don't see any prospect for that at all. And the problem is because these are absolute parallel universes when it comes to viewing this conflict. So Nikki Haley, who is the ambassador to the United Nations for the United States, she doesn't have a clue what's going on in Syria. She only can repeat the briefing or the memo that's given to her. She repeats that as her statement. She clearly doesn't know. If she did see what was actually going on, she would see that these are killers basically hauled up in a city, keeping residents from leaving. It's been 5 years now. So there are humanitarian corridors set up, but these residents, who many of them are families of these terrorists, have had opportunity to leave with their children. The fact that they're keeping their kids and their wives or their people there, that speaks volumes as to what sort of people you're actually dealing with there. And that is the heart of the problem. Patrick, can we just briefly expand on what you said a moment or two ago? Terrorist groups, including ISIL, al-Nusra, they're not included in the ceasefire. Russia has repeatedly accused them of hiding in the civilian population, using them as human shields. So is there any real clarity here over which areas can be targeted and which cannot? I imagine this is going to be a bigger talking point in the coming days.
No, there's not clarity. It's hugely difficult. Look, if the Syrian government and the Russians were as ruthless as they're portrayed in the West, Syrian government could have gone in all guns blazing 4 or 5 years ago, and it could have ended it, but it would have to a huge civilian life cost. So in Aleppo, the same thing. It was a long, drawn-out, protracted affair, back and forth. And there was huge loss of life on both sides, but even more so on West Aleppo and the government-held side, which was being sieged with hell cannons for 4 or 5 years. So this is the same problem we're having in Ghouta. It could be a protracted long-term thing. They're well dug underground, by the way. This is not spoken about in the Western media. The terrorists have sophisticated tunnel systems that go, in some cases, almost all the way to the old city. This is a huge security risk as well for Damascus. So, you know, the United States contingent has no idea what they're talking about with regards to the facts on the ground in Damascus, let alone anywhere else in Syria. As they were wrong in Aleppo, they're wrong again in Ghouta.
The thoughts this hour of Patrick Henningsen, editor of 21stCenturyWire.com. Patrick, thanks as always.